And what this is drawing on is a particular strand of my work, which is looking at the language of development and the history of development, about what people say or organizations say or policies say they are trying to do, and then saying, well, actually, is that really what you're trying to do? Or are you using a particular set of words, a particular policy to perhaps do something very different? And this is where I find the history of looking at development and development ideas quite interesting, because I think if you look at good governance from a historical perspective, it might give you perhaps some quite different reasons for why it emerged than if you just look at the writings of donors, of other writers who only focus on the contemporary, the now. Because all development ideas come from somewhere. You know, people who are engaged in development practice now think they are doing things based on evidence, based on best practice, based on what they hope will work. But actually it's all a trend. In 20 years' time, people will look back on this period and say, what on earth do those guys think they were doing? They're crazy. Exactly the same way that we look back to 1980s and are critical of that. People in the 80s look back to the 70s and 60s and so on. And you can go back and back and back. And I want to draw on some of the things that Carlos was talking about yesterday. Because as I think he showed yesterday, or he argued that one could argue that good governance in some cases has led to weaker governance and government. Now you can look at that and you can say, well, why would that be the case? Is that just because it's failed? The programs, the projects to improve capacity, to introduce good governance have failed. Therefore, in order to achieve good governance, we do something different. But maybe there's another way of looking at it. Actually, maybe good governance has been very successful, because maybe good governance actually isn't about making governments better, making them more democratic, making them more transparent. That may be one of the things, but that may not be its complete or underlying objective. And we need to question that. Now, I want to preface what I'm saying by telling you I am going to be presenting an argument. I don't want you to sit there and think that I must be right, because I may not be. There may be many or some or all of you in this room who will disagree with the interpretation that I'm going to be putting on the rise of good governance, and that's fine. But the important thing is about questioning it, not just accepting it. So what do we mean about good governance? Governance, I think, I'm sure, I can't remember who it was, but on Monday someone pointed out that governance is not a new idea. People have been talking about governance for thousands of years, just as and right up to today. It's, you know, how do you make your government work better? How do governments, or how can we ensure that governments do the kinds of things that they're supposed to be doing? What is the role of government? What should governments be doing, and what they should or should they not be doing? What is their relationship, or what should their relationship be with non-state actors, with the private sector, with the market, with charitable organisations, philanthropy, and so on? And what should effective government be doing? And people have written countlessly over the generations about their interpretation of what government is. So the first thing to note is that the good governance agenda is not a new focus on governance. What it is it's a particular take on governance. It is saying we reject previous or we are reforming previous ideas of what government should look like, what they should do and how they should function, and suggesting that perhaps they should do and look like and be something else in order to achieve the broader development goals they were hoping to look for. And it emerged in particular during the late 1980s, early 1990s. And to start off with, I want to look at the three drivers of the good governance agenda, where it came for, before moving on to look at actually how good governance was framed in those early years. And the first main driver, unsurprisingly, was the experience of structural adjustment. And structural adjustment itself was sparked by debates on governance, on what states should and shouldn't be doing. And it was a response, as I'm sure you will know, to the economic crises of the late 1970s and early 1980s. Up until this period, from around the 1940s until the mid-1970s, across the world, whether you were in Europe, North America, Asia, or Africa, the answer to who should be doing development, who should be in charge of development, was the state. The state dominated development practice, development policy, development implementation, development management. It was the job of the state. That is what states should be doing. But then, of course, in the economic crises of the late 1970s, states no longer, or many developing country states were no longer able to perform the tasks that they said that they ought to be doing. Increasing debt, rising fiscal problems, the story that we all know. And this led to people asking about this question about the role of the state. And the answer suddenly changed. From being the answer to development, suddenly the state became the obstacle. So rather than saying the state should be doing development, the answer became now the state should be sitting back, because the state is blocking progress towards development. And this, of course, leads on to structural adjustment. The programs that were enforced upon countries in order to get them to reform. Why get them to reform? Because by doing these reforms, by undertaking these reforms, this would improve economic growth, and it would bring, or it would renew progress in development. It would start to speed up development once again as you got higher growth. So this was seen as the answer. So, and it's the kind of things that we all know about, the kind of things that many of you, all of you will have experienced. Governments being forced to downsize, the shrinking of the state, the rolling back of the state. So civil servants being made redundant, departments being cut down drastically in size to reduce the physical size of the government, and in doing so to reduce the role that it was playing in society. Privatisation, so selling off public assets, public companies, the logic of the market. If the state was the obstacle to development under structural adjustment, the market was the answer. State controls over exchange rates removed, and other reforms that again took away the power of the state to have control over fiscal policy. And all of this linked into marketisation or liberalisation. But the problem is, by the end of the 1980s, it's clear that it hadn't worked. The promised gains weren't occurring. In particular, African economies were not growing at the rate that the proponents of structural adjustment said they would if these reforms were being put in place. So what was going wrong? Why were the promised reforms not taking effect in the way they should be? Now again, who is asking the question? If it was African governments, African policy analysts who were asking that question, the response may have been very different. But it wasn't. It was people in the World Bank, donors, the IMF who were asking these kind of questions. Why is it that development has not occurred? And there were two ways of looking at this. Either the policies themselves, the reforms, were not suitable, were never going to achieve the aims that they hoped for, or perhaps it was the context in which those reforms were being implemented, the countries themselves. And there's no surprise for guessing what the answer was. It wasn't the policies. The reforms were right, according to the logic of this argument. It was the countries. So what was wrong with those countries? And the analysis starts to say, well, they have weak institutions. They don't have effective legal frameworks that provide rapid, independent justice. They don't have effective accounting systems. So they lack fiscal accountability. Governments are still intervening too much and in an uncoordinated and non-predictable fashion. There's no transparent decision making. And also the issue of corruption and patronage, which starts to get talked about a lot more during this period. So the answer then comes, or the answer to that is, well, if you can transform those states, if you can turn all these things around, turn weak institutions into strong institutions, create accountability, create all these effective, efficient systems, then the reforms can be implemented in a much more effective way. So this is not about saying the state is important, bring back the state, as some people characterize it. They talk about, bringing the state back in. They're doing that in some way, but because they think a more effective state can carry on doing exactly what structural adjustment policy was doing. And of course, the cynic or the realist, depending on your perspective, will also note that it's probably a lot better for donors and for international finance institutions to be able to say, we're not implementing these reforms. It's the Tanzanian government who is choosing to implement these reforms. It's the Ugandan government who are implementing these reforms to give this sense of local ownership, which is spurious at best. But nonetheless, the answer to the question and the people who are asking and answering that question gives rise to a particular analysis. And this becomes put most fervently in the first major international document to talk about governance in the sense of good governance as we would know it now. And it's the World Bank Sub-Saharan Africa from Crisis to Sustainable Growth report in 1989. There is a version on the World Bank website, I think, if you're interested in looking at it. It's an interesting read. And so they identify right from the start. So this is, both these quotes are from the first page. So underlying the litany of Africa's development problems is a crisis of governance. It's not a crisis of donors and other institutions imposing unpopular, unworkable reforms. It is first and foremost a crisis of governance. And the assessment that they come to is that overall Africans are as poor today as they are 30 years ago. So they talk about slow or even negative economic growth in this report. The fact that per capita incomes are falling rather than rising. The collapse in the provision of welfare services. Increased hunger. Progress in social development is being eroded, is being stalled. Now again, all of those things are charges that are levelled at the impact of structural adjustment. But here, this is being levelled at the problem of governance. Because African governments, and this is very much focused on Africa, and sub-Saharan Africa in particular, because sub-Saharan African governments are not effective, they cannot implement the reforms that would lead to development. So really good governance right from this start, as we'll come back to, may actually be more about protecting and rolling out even further structural adjustment, albeit in a velvet glove, than it is about restoring or promoting democracy participation. So it talks here about, well, what do we need to do to the state? So it's the failure of public institutions. This is why economies haven't grown, why therefore development isn't taking place as rapidly as it should, or is even going into reverse. So market mechanisms are important, but they go hand in hand with good governance. So to some extent, and this is why people have used it as kind of the World Bank kind of giving a mea culpa, holding its hands up and saying, yeah, we got it wrong with structural adjustment. It's not really what they're saying, but there's enough of the language here to suggest that is what they're saying. And so it goes on to talk about Africa not needing less government, so it is perhaps moving away from the rolling back of the state, but better government. But this is the important line. Government that concentrates its efforts less on direct interventions and more on enabling others to be productive. So what is the hallmark? If you're asked that question, what is good governance? The answer from that quote seems to be a good government is one that allows the market to flourish and therefore promote economic growth. It's not one where the state is intervening. It's not a central command economy. And this is given further impetus because during the late 1980s, early 1990s, it's the end of the Cold War, it's the collapse of the Soviet system, and it's part of this period of what people like Huntington have called third wave democratization. So if those of you who've read or heard of work by people like Francis Fukuyama who talk about the end of history, it looks like history is ending because everyone is going to become a multi-party liberal democracy. Now, 15 years on, or how is it 15, even 20 years on, I think we can look back at that and laugh. But at the time, this was seen as serious stuff. This was seen as solid, decent analysis of the way the world was going. But it has an impact on good governance because it adds this other dimension, which is the stress on democracy, and in particular, multi-party democracy. So because you have this rise of pro-democratic movements in many parts of the world, and because you have the collapse of the biggest model at the time of state-directed economies, of state intervention, state-led development, it appears that those who argue for liberalisation and the dominance, the prominence of the market appear to have won that battle. It looks like they've won. And certainly that's the way it's presented. So neoliberalism looks like it is the answer, and multipartyism looks like the answer. The history of what's going on in that period seems to suggest that you don't want large authoritarian autocratic states. What you want is relatively small, efficient states who are providing decent regulation and allowing other actors to flourish and to rise. And that brings in this multi-party democracy angle to good governance. And I want to come back, but just to remind yourselves of what Carlos was saying yesterday about there are differences between is multi-party democracy, even if we assume that is the best outcome, and I'm certainly not suggesting it is, but is that an essential part of good governance, or actually is that something that comes from good governance? But in this model, it starts to become seen as part of the package. And of course, again, as Carlos was pointing out yesterday, the end of the Cold War has an impact on aid levels and on patronage. So donors are no longer using the aid that they give to prop up authoritarian regimes that support them in opposition to their ideological rivals. So you can see this most clearly, but it happens everywhere, I think, in places like Zaire, now DRC, where Mobutu is put under increasing pressure to reform, having effectively been told he can do whatever he likes. And as he refuses to reform quickly enough, he's dropped. And the US and other Western governments come to terms with Kabila and recognize him as the new government. They no longer need the strongman Mobutu because they're not facing down their Cold War rival anymore. So all of this sets in motion the background to good governance. So again, whenever you read any policy document that tells you about a new approach to development, you need to look at that but think about where it's coming from. Why is that emerging now? Why are we seeing this as being particularly important now? Good governance doesn't come out of a vacuum. It's not suddenly that someone wakes up in the morning and thinks, oh, hang on a minute, wouldn't it be great if governments were more effective, more efficient, and this is the way they looked. It was a response to a particular moment in time, just as structural adjustment was, just as every decade you go back and you can see wider influences on the development of particular discourses around development. So this is where we end up. 1992, it's not actually the World Development Report, sorry, I was supposed to change that. It's the World Bank Report, Governance and Development. And this is where good governance is now outlined as a policy, as a strategy, as a new approach that the World Bank thinks needs to be taken in directing aid, in directing loans, in directing the way that donors and IFIs should be interacting with governments and states and the kinds of things that they should be doing. And so it signals this change in policy. It's not, there's a lot of background to it, but this is the moment where we can actually see that policy coming to fruition and being fleshed out a little more. And this is where we start to see this new emphasis, or renewed emphasis rather, on state institutions. Acceptance that the state has a role to play in development, but now what is that role? And it argues that good governance is important for two reasons. Firstly, because it's a good government and good governance is essential to creating and sustaining an environment that is conducive to both economic growth and development. And it also suggests that sound management or good governance means that World Bank investments will be invested more efficiently and will get a better outcome or more outcome than they might if a government was poor. So it's partly about a broad attempt to say this is the way that we think government should look, but it's also linked to the way the World Bank thinks it should be working, rather than a call for necessarily all donors to follow this. And it defines good governance as the manner in which power is exercised in the management of a country's economic and social resources for development. So good governance for the World Bank is synonymous with sound development management. It's a rather technical understanding of good governance, and this leads, as we'll see later, to divergence in understandings of what actually good governance should be. And we start to see different tracks, different approaches to understanding that. And here we go, linking into the second point up there. It's central to creating and sustaining an environment which fosters strong and equitable development. And it's important for the implementation of sound economic policies. So the state has a more important role, certainly a more important role than a lot of the policy documents around structural adjustment suggest. It's toning down some of that very strong neoliberal language that sees the state as, continues to see the state as an obstacle and as a danger to development. So even in societies that are highly market-oriented, only governments can provide certain public goods. So rules to make markets work efficiently, and corrective interventions when there are market failures. So in other words, what a business wants is to know exactly what it has to do and when and to whom it has to pay licenses and what it can expect in return in order to thrive. It doesn't want to have unpredictable laws, laws that are applied in different ways at different times. It also points out the social function of the state, recognizing there are certain things that for-profit private sector organizations cannot or will not do. So education, health, and essential infrastructure, and in particular pro-poor welfare services. The notion that private sector providers would come in and provide education and hospitals for the poorest rather than for the elite simply doesn't work. Now, again, any historian looking at this would think, well, what kind of idiot would think that anyway? What kind of idiot would think that private sector were going to play this role? Because this is precisely the problem had, or the British Empire had in sub-Saharan Africa when it first came in. So in the 1890s and early 1900s, the colonial governments in sub-Saharan Africa said, we're not going to do anything, we're going to get private sector providers to come in and provide all of this. And then no one came. Why would they? Where were they going to make their money? And so the state gradually took on more and more responsibilities. If you look at Europe and the rise of the welfare state, the answer from the 1940s and 1950s was, we can't rely on the private sector, we need states to do these things because no one else will do them. Everyone talks about the privatization of health in the United States, and it is iniquitous, it is inequitable, but it's worth pointing out that the United States, despite its private health system, still spends more as per capita from the public purse on health than does the UK with its National Health Service. So historians would look at this and think, still in 1992 you finally realised that states have a role to play, but better late than never perhaps. So from this they start to draw out some ideas about what a good governance state should look like. What are the hallmarks of good governance? How do you know it when you see it? And the fact that we still have a multitude of tables, the fact that organisations like the Ibrahim Foundation have come along and said, well, we need to do something different because the other things aren't doing a good enough job, shows that there still isn't that much unanimity on how to recognise a good government when you see it. But in this report, they highlight some what have become fairly standard ideas. So clear separation of the public and the private. So politicians, officials shouldn't see public funds as for their own private use. So this is partly linked into issues around corruption. Predictable legal regulatory frameworks. So individuals, companies, communities, societies know exactly what can and can't be done. They know how and where to go and get justice, and they know that justice will be impartial, rapid, and independent. Wide-based decision-making, so trying to avoid decisions being taken by narrow elites, trying to increase people. They're not talking about democracy, and that's important to remember, but they are talking about widening participation, not just keeping decision-making in a very narrow elite. And of course, full transparency and full accountability. So all of these things might lead on to a call for multi-party democracy, but the World Bank itself is not actually doing that at this time. So what we end up with by sort of 92, 93 is a definition of good governance from the World Bank that is is a technical one. If we go back to this quote, where are we? Here. Good governance for the World Bank is synonymous with sound development management. Now, development management is not about politics. The World Bank is not interested in engaging with politics. So it's definition of good governance is technocratic. It's about institutions rather than the policies that those institutions are pursuing themselves. But that isn't the only way of seeing good governance. And almost as soon as this version comes out, then other organisations, other donors start to adapt it. And this is where we start to see the divergence. We start to see the emergence of a more politicised understanding of good governance. So, and there are many donors that I could have done this from, so I've only picked 4. But for example, the United Nations emphasises empowerment and political dimensions of governance. So it talks about good governance should be about empowering people, should be about participation. The UNDP, for example, includes issues such as human rights, something you will not see in the list of the World Bank's criteria for good governance, as well as legislative support, judicial reform, and of course, starting to move here into multi-party democracy. Kofi Annan, whilst UN Secretary General, talked about good governance as being a respect for rights and the rule of law, strengthening democracy, and promoting transparency and capacity. So some issues you see coming up again and again, and increasingly we're starting to see the influence of politics and democracy, and in particular multi-party democracies. DFID again emphasise some issues that are the same as the World Bank, but they also suggest that policies are important, not just institutional. This isn't just about development management, it's also about the politics and the policies of development. They talk about pro-poor policies, they talk about political systems that create opportunities for people, and in particular for the poor. They talk about equitable and universal distribution of welfare services. So it's not just the state providing welfare services equally, but equitably. And there's an important distinction there. So, for example, you can have something that's equal, so you might have one hospital to which all people within a certain area can go if they choose to, and that might be seen as equal provision of healthcare services, but it isn't necessarily equitable because some people have greater healthcare needs than others, or different healthcare needs that aren't met by hospitals. So some people might, in an equitable system, actually look like they have more institutional framework to meet their needs. So the fact that the DFID are using the word equitable rather than equal is an important distinction that they're making. They also talk about management of conflict, so they're bringing in issues around conflict management as well as linking it to achieving development targets. And they specifically criticise the World Bank for its rather narrow approach and suggest that the World Bank approach to good governance needs to be broadened out, that you can't simply focus on the technical, the institutional, that you need to engage with the politics and the policies. The US also has, again, a very political understanding of good governance, and this comes through in its relations as a donor with developing countries, where Carlos was talking yesterday about conditionality and the increase in the number of conditions that have been associated with good governance. And the US is one donor amongst many who have incorporated such ideas. So, for example, countries who are eligible for the Millennium Challenge Account funding have to meet a set of pretty overtly political criteria. So promoting political pluralism. In other words, you can't just say you're having a democracy of your own type. You have to show you are moving towards a multi-party liberal democracy. Respect for human rights, and they actually name specific rights that that countries are expected to, again, not just say they are respecting, but demonstrate they are respecting. Protecting private property rights. Again, that's reflecting US or perhaps Western notions of property ownership, seen as very important. When you transplant the notion of private property rights into systems where you have a whole variety of different systems of land tenure, land ownership and access to land, that's potentially highly problematic. And then encouraging transparency and accountability, and then efforts to combat corruption. And the US has been very strong on corruption in particular. The African Growth and Opportunity Act, not a development tool in itself, but a process by which countries can export without paying tariffs to the United States. Again, although it's a trade document, includes highly political provisions. So again, political pluralism and the rule of law, poverty reduction policies, tackling corruption. Again, a very strong emphasis on human rights, and specifically human rights of workers and human rights of children, and protecting children from labour. And the African Union itself, again, in its formal statements on governance and the commitment of the AU as a whole to governance, takes a rather political line. So it sees it as tremendously important. Good governance is a basic requirement for peace, security, and sustainable political and socio-economic development. And then in its declaration on democracy, political, economic and corporate governance, again, you can see here that it's incorporating some of these more political ideas. So it's not adopting the same perspective as the World Bank. In particular, the last one, in the light of Africa's recent history, respect for human rights has to be accorded an importance and an urgency all of its own. So again, giving great stress to the importance of rights. So where's the World Bank 10 years on? So after its 1992 report, in 2002 it returned to its theme of good governance. So where are we now? And it didn't reverse its position, but it softened its position perhaps, acknowledging that there is a political dimension to good governance, or the good governance agenda, that the World Bank hadn't given enough attention to in the past. But it also suggested that it was in some ways right to do that policies are important, but actually institutions are perhaps even more important. So although the language, as with all of these documents, suggests some kind of reversal in position, when you start to read further down, actually you just see a defence of the way that they have been approaching it, and very little evidence that they're changing the way that they're doing things. Now, the differences may not actually be as wide as are often assumed. I think this is where we come back to some of the things that Carlos was talking about yesterday, about whether, for example, human rights, is that an outcome of good governance, or is that an essential part of good governance? So if you're a donor, do you say you have to institute an effective human rights regime as part of good governance in order to demonstrate you are good, and therefore in the indices that are presented your ranking will be higher because that's the hallmark of good governance? Or the World Bank would argue that a lot of these things are actually outcomes, that if you have good governance, one of the outcomes is human rights. So it's a fairly subtle distinction, but it's an important one in that it shapes the way institutions interact and promote and work with good governance, and again creates this confusion over who is doing what. To return to the point that I made at the start, which is what actually is good governance. Are there ways of seeing it that perhaps looking through the language that is used and saying, well, actually maybe good governance is about things that they're not saying, or that the policies aren't saying, that it might be about trying to do something else entirely. So whereas an evaluation might suggest that good governance is failing in certain circumstances, if you look at it from a slightly different angle, maybe it's doing exactly what it should be doing. Maybe it's actually doing something that it doesn't say it's intending to do, but nevertheless it is. So to return to this issue of the political, because the politics of this is tremendously important. Now, the bank argues that it is not allowed to engage with the politics of the internal politics of a country, which is why its understanding of good governance is so technical. It's about development management. It's not about development policies and the politics of development. But this has been criticised, and this apolitical approach has been one of the most criticised aspects of the World Bank approach. So I've just picked two people, Leftwich. Again, how the politics of development is completely taken out of this. We're left with something dry, something managerial. And again, if you see the problems as being managerial, you will attempt to apply managerial remedies. If you see the problems as political, that leads you down very different avenues. Tom Weiss, again, looking at how politics or the political sting has been taken out of the debate by the World Bank approach, and by extension through the conditions and the interactions that the World Bank has had with those people with whom it's worked. But this is a wider problem, because arguably one of the major problems over the past 20, 30 years has been the withdrawal of politics from the language of development. Now, that may not be true in this room. It isn't true in SOAS's Development Studies Department. But if you go to, and I'm sure many of you have, if you go to meetings about development with development practitioners and policy analysts, often the talk just completely has no bearing at all on politics. So I was at a meeting a couple of weeks ago with the British, one of the British international development ministers, someone from the Bill Gates Foundation, a couple of for-profit organisations, including pharmaceutical companies, as well as some non-profit advocacy organisations. And all of the talk was good, it was important, it was about the commitment to increasing aid, and it was about how the aid should be used, what the best ways of integrating the market and for-profit companies are into the mix. But at no point did anyone say, well, hang on a minute, do we actually want to integrate for-profit companies? So this was specifically on health. You have a pharmaceutical company, a representative there, and no one raised the point that many would blame pharmaceutical companies or say they have had a significant role in delaying the rolling out of treatments and other forms of medicine for diseases precisely because they are for-profit, market-based actors. Now, there's an argument there. There are arguments on both sides, but that argument just doesn't appear because people focus on the technical. They focus on what does the evidence say is the next thing we should do, therefore let's go and do that, rather than stepping back and saying, well, actually, what about the politics of this? But what is development? Development is about taking resources and then allocating them to some groups and not others, giving some groups a greater share, other groups a smaller share. That's almost the very definition of politics. So if you take the political out of development, then I'm not sure you're talking about development anymore, because you can't separate the two. Development is also about power, because people have control and access to certain resources and others don't. But again, if people aren't talking about the politics and they aren't talking about the power, then what actually are they talking about? So even though we talk about the increased political understanding of good governance from DFID, from US, from the UN and from others, I'd argue they're not really engaging with the fundamental politics. They're talking about certain issues that are indeed political, but at the expense of perhaps some of the bigger questions. We go back to this discussion that's had kind of 1989, 1990. Why is it that structural adjustment isn't happening? Is it or development isn't happening despite structural adjustment reforms? Is it because those reforms are poorly designed, poorly implemented, and just the wrong policies to achieve the goals that planners are hoping for, or is it the problem with the governments? And because right from the start the answer is seen in technical terms, it's seen as it's the environment in which they're being implemented, the politics suddenly disappears. Also, is this actually a victory for the state? So again, a lot of analysis of good governance. I'm sure actually I've used this term myself, rolling the state back out, bringing the state back in. It seems right. You know, you can see it in the documents. The good governance agenda is saying strong governments, effective governments are important, that governments need to provide certain things that other institutions can't do. So to some extent it seems that, well, maybe actually we are bringing back the state. But actually I'm not sure that's what we're doing. And there are others who would argue that really what you're looking at when we're talking about the good governance agenda is just simply another way to implement the reforms that were attempted to being implemented in the 1980s, but in a different way. It didn't work imposing them from above. So if you change the environment, then those reforms can be implemented. And to be fair, if you read the documents carefully, rather than just the headlines that are presented, that's very explicitly what they're saying. A good government is a government that is able to implement reforms, is able to provide regulation without being overburdensome, is able to allow the market sector to flourish. Yes, it intervenes when market failures occur, when there is an egregious abuse by a particular company, by a particular sector. But that's not particularly controversial. That doesn't go against anything that structural adjustment policies were advocating for in the past. So perhaps what good governance is really about is further rooting the market, further rooting neoliberal reforms within developing countries under a mask of trying to say the state is important. But actually what you're trying to do is say the state must do this. So when you're looking at the criteria for good governance, actually that just means it's a government that is implementing reforms. It's a government that is trying to do the things that IFIs have wanted governments to do for a long time, but perhaps doing itself, or at least suggesting, playing the game, saying that it is doing it itself, rather than being forced to do so. And the other problem is that the model that gets put forward is very clearly the Western model. The liberal multi-party democracy is seen as one of the hallmarks of good governance. There's no debate, there's no questioning whether that is the sole model, whether that is something that is appropriate in all cases. Now, it may well be that the answer is that perhaps multi-party democracy of the Western model is the best governance model. But there's lots of people who would disagree with that, whose voices don't get heard in this. It's taken for granted that this is, or everyone is signed up to this. So just to draw things to a close, good governance clearly has multiple definitions. With many development discourses, much development language, that's obviously the case. But all of those have different outcomes. And in fact, I'd say one of the reasons that good governance has been a particularly successful language to use, or approach, a paradigm, is precisely because it is so vague. So everyone can sit around the room and say, yes, we think good governance is appropriate, because ultimately, who's going to argue it isn't? You know, you want your government to be good. But when I'm in my head, I'm thinking good governance, and what someone from a particular donor or from the World Bank or from a developing country government might be thinking, we might all be having a different idea of what we think good governance is. And unless we actually put our cards on the table and says, this is my definition of good governance, do you agree with me? Do you disagree with me? Then it doesn't really have any power, it doesn't have any use, except that everyone can sign up to this thing and then perhaps go off and try and do what they want with it. And of course it's great for donors and IFIs, because it fits in very nicely with this language of ownership. Fits in very nicely with this language of non-conditionality, even if it's wrought, it's run through completely with conditions. But it might also be used as a cover. So the language of good governance, what it says it's trying to do, may actually act as a mask for doing something else. And there comes a point with any kind of development intervention where you start to say, this failure is happening so often. Is it really a failure, or actually is that what is intended to do? James Ferguson, looking at development in Lesotho, noted that one of the outcomes of development interventions was that the state become ever more intrusive in distant rural areas. So you'd build a road, the first thing that would be built would be a party office. The police would start to have a new office there. Central authority became much firmer. The actual development outcomes, the things that were written in the documents, increasing food availability, increasing cattle productivity, they didn't really change. But what did change was this massive increase in state power and state control. And he argued that rather than see that project as a failure, it was actually a success, because it was never really about development. And I think in some ways good governance is one of those policies. For many individuals, it may be a really important development policy. But I'm not sure that's true for everyone. And the important question is that true for those who have the most power, those who are able to dictate, those who are able to push their reforms further? So I just want to really leave you with some questions. Again, I want to reiterate, I'm putting forward an argument. Now, I might be wrong. There may be many of you who disagree with my argument. But the point is that I want you to think. When you hear the words good governance, I don't want you to assume that everyone's speaking the same thing. I don't want you to assume that it is necessarily benign. I want you to think and to challenge and to question exactly what is meant and what that individual or that organisation means when they use it. So is good governance addressing the key needs of development? Or actually is it addressing the interests of donors? Is this still yet another way of implementing donor policies and donor aspirations? Are the greatest constraints on the national level, in which case perhaps good governance is something that can be worked out or that will be successful if the problem is within individual developing countries? Or actually is the problem at the international level? Is it about international trade laws? Is it about the international balances of power? Is it about who has control over certain issues? Because good governance doesn't address those. That's when we're starting to move into kind of the real political debate, which is taken out of good governance. And how can the good governance agenda be implemented if we think it is something that should be implemented? Are conditions the way to do it? Can you really improve governance by conditionality? And finally, if, again, assuming that the good governance process is something that is of potential benefit, has it yet been internalised? Is this something that governments have subscribed to? Or is it that governments say they have subscribed to because it is the only way they get access to certain forms of funding? It's the only way that they can get aid. Tanzania is an example of it is seen as the golden child of donors because it is seen as reforming, it is seen as being committed to good governance. And over the past year or two, its halo has slipped slightly, to mix my metaphors. And but it's about good governance. It's not doing what it's supposed to be doing from the donor's perspective. So therefore, it starts to be seen potentially as a country that is no longer on the path to good governance because it's no longer doing what donors have been telling it to do. Okay, we're going to, I think, yes, I forgot that one. Is good governance the only appropriate model? Again, assuming there is one, assuming there are a multitude of definitions, different ways of putting it into practice, but also the notion of kind of the Western model as applied. Are there other models that could perhaps come through that are perhaps not given a hearing or are perhaps presented as dangerous, but actually may have something important to say, something important to contribute? Okay, I've seen one hand go up. I think I think the agreement is we're going to finish.